All right, cool. So my name is Kevin Hutchison. I'm a senior at the University of Georgia, and this summer I worked underneath Andrew Will, Dr. Peterman, and Dr. Crawford, and we looked at the effects of historical disturbances on plethodontid salamanders in the Great Smoky Mountains. And so before I get into what I did for the summer, I'd just like to take a moment and touch on why we should study salamanders and what makes them important. They're small, they're slimy, they're cryptic, they're not often seen in the public eye like a bear or a bird would be, but they're nonetheless very important. I could honestly spend 15 minutes talking about this subject alone. But when you look at it from an ecological standpoint, there's two things that really stick out to me. And the first is that they're very efficient animals. They're ectotherms as opposed to being endothermic like us. So rather having to burn energy to maintain their body temperature, they maintain their body temperature based off environmental conditions and behavior. And so I have a table here from Pew 1980 that looks at the net efficiency of caloric intake. And you might not be able to see it for you in-person people, but there's mountain dusky salamanders, Desmognathus acrophius. It is 76 to 98% net efficient when it comes to burning calories. As opposed to a endotherm of similar mass, the highest it gets is 1.22%. So this is basically saying that rather than burning off energy to try to maintain their body temperature, they're keeping energy within the ecosystem, within the environment. The next thing is that there is a lot of salamanders. Again, you don't realize this because you don't see salamanders unless you're looking for them. But when you do and you're in a good area, you have insane amounts of density. Burton and Likens, 1975, looked at eastern redback salamanders in an experimental forest in New Hampshire, and they compared the biomass of this one species and found that it is twice that of all the birds during peak migratory period. So you have this huge food source that's also like found throughout the woods, which basically makes the salamanders the protein bars of the forest. They're everywhere and they keep energy in the forest. All right, so now with that out of the way, I'm going to dive into more like what I did. And so the Great Smoky Mountains is located in the Southern Appalachians on the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. This is an area that is well known for its diversity and is often cited as the salamander capital of the world, with 31 species of salamander being found within the park boundaries. But those boundaries weren't always there. The park was established in 1934. And prior to that establishment, there was a long history of various disturbances within the national park. Now, these disturbances varied, and you can classify them into 5 different categories, which is what Pyle 1998 did. They classified as commercial logging, which is what you kind of see in this photo here. It's just clear-cut, totally non-sustainable logging procedures. You have diffuse disturbances, which is a matrix of subsistence logging, homesteading, raising cattle, and I think small fires. You have selective logging, which is a bit more sustainable logging, so taking like every 5th tree or something like that. You have settled areas, which is homesteading and a bit more intensive agriculture, like planting corn. And then you finally have undisturbed, which is what it sounds like. This is your old growth virgin tracts of forest. And so knowing this, we asked the question, how do like each of these categories influence salamander abundance nearly 100 years down the line? So in 2034, the park will have its 100th birthday. And so we're going to look at how that affects abundances. And so we came up with this hypothesis. And so we expected that the settled category to have the lowest amount of plethodontid abundance, followed by commercially logged, diffuse disturbances, selectively logged, and finally undisturbed, having the highest amount of abundances. And so to solve this hypothesis, we used GIS and we selected at least 10 sites in each of the 5 categories, so roughly 50 sites. And then at each of these sites, we performed visual encounter surveys at night when salamanders are active. We performed 2 back-to-back 25-meter transects over 3 sampling periods. And so we chose to do this because Hyde and Simmons in 2001 showed that visual encounter surveys are not only the most productive way of finding salamanders, but it's also not very disruptive. So I took this photo of one of our surveys. This is 2 Plethodon Jordani just being active out at night on a tree doing their own thing. And so on each of these 25-meter transects, we recorded the counts of the number of salamanders that we saw. And so oftentimes over the summer, it felt like I was just being paid to do this. And so when we tallied all of our results, we found that we had documented 896 salamanders of 12 species. 11 of these species are Plethodontid salamanders. This in vir here is Nophthothalamus viridescens. That's eastern newts. That's not a Plethodontid. But our we looked at the 5 highest amounts of species we saw. Plethodon jordani is the highest, then Eurisia wilderae, Plethodon glutinosus, and we combined, it should be noted that we combined Plethodon glutinosus and Plethodon teahali because they're nearly indistinguishable from each other and we don't fully understand their distribution within the park. Desmognathus radi, and finally Desmognathus imitator. So those are our 5 most encountered salamanders, and those are the ones that we're going to be looking at throughout the rest of the presentation. And then looking at the disturbance categories, undisturbed had the highest amount of counts, which makes sense. However, diffuse disturbance had the lowest amount, which is not exactly what we were expecting. So we have the counts. Now we need to find the abundance of each salamanders in each category. And so to do this, we used a package in R called Unmarked Bayesian Models in STAN. This is going to be used to model the abundance while also accounting for imperfect detection of salamanders. And so basically what this model does is it uses environmental conditions at the time, which include humidity, air temperature, soil temperature, and it uses those as well as the counts that we had to predict P sub t, which is our detection probability, the likelihood that we would see a salamander if it was active that night. And so then we use detection probability, the counts, and then locality information, which is elevation, distance from stream, leaf litter depth, and canopy cover to model N sub I, which is our abundances. And so when we did this, there were some general effect trends. This is not super important, but the main takeaway should be that areas that are high in elevation, close to streams, have large canopy cover, and then deep leaf litter are all very good for salamanders. And there was also a correlation between elevation and stream distance. So as we get higher in elevation, you are able to find more salamanders further away from streams. And so this is our results, our analysis. So Desmognathus radi was most abundant in the diffuse disturbance category, which was interesting. Desmognathus imitator was most abundant in the settled category. Plethodon glutinosus was most abundant in the commercially logged category, and Plethodon jordani was most abundant in selective cut. And finally, Eurisia wilderae was also most abundant in selective cut. So just some initial observations here is that the category in which each species of salamander was most abundant varied drastically. The only overlap was with Eurisia wilderae and Plethodon jordani. However, kind of contrary to that, the majority of these 5 species, their lowest category was commercially logged. And so this makes a bit more sense when you think about it. I'm going to touch on that, I think I'm more on the next slide. So yeah, again, this is a bit confusing. So Desmognathus radi, for example, is a high elevation, generally considered a high elevation species. They prefer like very moist, deep forests. So why are they seemingly most abundant in a diffuse disturbance area? We don't really know that. So it's something to think about moving on. Part of the reason why the abundances may vary so much is that salamanders may be more robust to certain disturbances where less robust to others. So they may be, basically, they might be able to survive a settled area more so than a commercially logged area. We tried to account for elevation when selecting our sites. The problem is that some categories like settled obviously are mostly at low elevations because those are the easiest areas to settle, whereas undisturbed is mostly at high elevations because that's the hardest area to log. So that might also explain away some of the reasons why they vary so much. But I really think like some of the main takeaways from this is that, so commercially logged is the lowest, and that makes sense considering all the disruption that happens in the soil. Pew 1987 talked about this as well. So when you clear cut an area, you're removing all that leaf litter, you're exposing the soil to drying out from the sun, and when you have machinery, you're compacting the soil so there's not as many burrows. But again, like the main takeaway from this entire presentation is that in 2034, it will be 100 years from when the park was established. So it's nearly 100 years later, and we are still seeing impacts from these disturbances today. Because if we weren't, across the categories, each species would have very similar abundances. They would be like kind of hitting equilibrium, but yet they're not. And so with that, I'd like to thank Andrew for his help and guidance on this project and being great companion on many long nights. Dr. Crawford and Dr. Peterman for their guidance and support. The National Park for allowing us to work in what is my favorite place on the planet. University of Tennessee for allowing us to stay at their rustic research station. Everyone at NGRREC for funding and support. OSU for funding. And finally, Dr. Maris, my advisor at UGA, for showing this position in the first place. And with that, I will be taking any questions.
Okay. I have a question. So whenever you were looking at like historic land use in general, I was just wondering if, I don't know if it would like fit into the time scale or anything, but if you looked at like any indigenous management, because I know the area that the like Smoky Mountains National Park is in was pretty extensively managed by the tribes that were there, like prior to colonial settlement, and then in some cases like after that as well. So I was just wondering if like there was any research done on that as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You're right, the park is like the native land for the Cherokee Nation. However, by 1934, they were mostly moved out of that area. I'm sure there was still some around, but at this point, we're thinking more of like Appalachian settlers, more so.
This isn't exactly like in line with the logging and everything, but I was wondering if like these populations of the Smoky Mountain salamanders are seeing any immediate threats from the B-cell fungus.
Yeah, I don't think B-cell has been recorded in North Carolina or Tennessee yet. However, there is chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus is just about everywhere at this point. It might have always been everywhere. And I know there's rhinovirus as well. Rhinovirus was discovered in Kate's Cove a couple of years ago, which is a threat as well.
Any other questions